working part-time for the Egyptian Exploration Fund, whose chief excavators were Flinders Petrie of London and Professor Edouard Naville from Geneva. In 1890, the Exploration Fund established the Archaeological Survey to document new discoveries before they were damaged or destroyed by the weather, visitors, or robbers. During the first season, Newbery was one of 3 men working on surveying and documenting tombs dating from around 2000 BC at the site of Beni Hassan. Mrs. Margaret Amherst was among the donors to the survey work and, as she had been impressed by young Howard's artistic skills, recommended him to join Antiquities Service. William Amherst had taken an interest in Petrie's excavations in Amarna and offered further financial support in exchange for a share of the artifacts for his collection. In an agreement negotiated by Newbery and finalized on the 2nd of January, Carter would serve as Petrie's agent, working on a designated sector for Amherst, which included the Great Temple. After accompanying Petrie to Akhenaten's tomb in late January, Carter produced several illustrations of the site to accompany a report in the British newspaper The Daily Graphic. Carter had been in Egypt as an artist, and he only received around a week's worth of instruction and excavation from Petrie before being left to the job, though the long walks he would take with Petrie across the Amarna plain would have given plenty of opportunity for Carter to learn from the great Egyptologist. Though his initial excavations found little of note, with the help of a team of local diggers, he would later find fragments of statues of Akhenaten and his wife, Queen Nefertiti. Carter's first season of excavations ended on an unhappy note after he learned of the death of his father on the 1st of May. By the end of the month, after packing their discoveries in 160 cases and sending them ahead, Petrie and Carter left for Cairo. In the meantime, Newbery had re-established himself as surveyor of the Archaeological Survey after the departure of Fraser and Blackton. Having completed his work with Petrie, Carter agreed to help Newbery ink the tracings from the tombs from Beni Hassan and Deir el-Bersha. Returning to Egypt in December 1892, Newbery, Carter, and a new team from the Archaeological Survey worked at Beni Hassan and Amarna, only to be denied permission from the new Director General of the Antiquities Service. Carter was then ordered to Cairo by the Egypt Exploration Fund to help document fragile papyri from a site on the Nile Delta discovered by Edouard Naville the previous year. After spending the best part of a month locating the papyri chambers, he had not received a permit from the Antiquities Service and rejoined Newbery by the middle of April, working on tombs at El Sheikh Said and later returning to Deir el-Bersha, making coloured copies of paintings and hieroglyphic inscriptions. Carter's work would find its way into the Archaeological Survey's 3rd and 4th volumes from Beni Hassan and all 4 volumes of its work at el-Bersha. However, at the end of the 1893 season, the Archaeological Survey decided to cease fieldwork operations due to a lack of funds, placing Carter's future in jeopardy. Carter was rescued from the uncertainty of his employment by securing a position assisting Edouard Naville at Deir el-Bahari, the mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile near the Valley of the Kings, opposite the ancient Egyptian capital of Thebes, modern-day Luxor. Naville had begun work on the site in February 1893 and spent much of the season clearing away the debris of 3 millennia. After joining Naville in December, Carter was responsible for copying the magnificent wall reliefs of the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh of the 18th dynasty who ruled during the first half of the 15th century BC. No longer working alongside Newbery, he abandoned the tracing technique and instead made his copies freehand. While Naville admired Carter's artistic skills, he complained that he was not working quickly enough, and Carter recommended sending for his elder brother, Vernet, who arrived in February 1894. The 2 Carter brothers worked on the site until the end of April, but Vernet would make no further contribution to the project after finding it difficult to cope with the Egyptian climate. Over the next 5 years, Carter worked with a number of different assistants whom he recruited through the network of artists maintained by his siblings in London. The work was published in the 6 volumes of the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, featuring 174 plates illustrated by Carter and his associates. In addition to his artistic duties, Carter occasionally supervised clearance work, helped to return rescued fragments to their original positions, and also served as the team's photographer. His duties had increased to the extent that he was effectively serving as Naville's deputy, and in July 1897 the Exploration Fund almost tripled his salary to £275 a year and instructed him to supervise reconstruction work on the temple, advised by the British architect Somers Clarke. At only 23 years old, Carter had established himself as a prominent Egyptologist. Back in early 1895, he had met the Amhersts on their extended tour of Egypt, and he would meet many more visitors from England who would occasionally commission paintings from him. Carter's abilities were not only recognised by the British, but also the French and Egyptians, and in late 1899 he was appointed one of 2 chief inspectors of antiquities at the Egyptian Antiquities Service. The Egyptian Antiquities Service had been founded in 1859 to take responsibility for the monuments and artifacts that were being unearthed all over the country by Egyptian and European archaeologists in the 19th century. Its founder was the Frenchman Auguste Mariette, and until 1952 all his successors as Director General were Frenchmen. In the summer of 1899, Gaston Maspero began a second stint as Director General, a development which pleased British Egyptologists as, during his first term, Maspero had been more willing than his predecessors to grant permits and licenses. In October, the service decided to appoint 2 European chief inspectors, one based in Cairo, responsible for Lower Egypt down to the Nile Delta, and the other based in Luxor, responsible for Upper Egypt up to the border with Sudan. Carter was given the latter post, owing his appointment to the recommendation of Maspero's good friend Edouard Naville. Maspero was impressed with Carter after their first meeting at Luxor at the end of December 1899, and although Carter lacked academic training, he more than compensated with his practical abilities as an artist and excavator, as well as his command of Arabic and his ability to get on well with the local population living near the archaeological sites. Carter's first task as chief inspector was to install iron gates to protect the royal tombs at the Theban necropolis from tomb robbers and visitors. He would frequently take European visitors to the tombs and monuments, and on occasion persuaded them to give donations to help cover the costs of his work. Although many of the royal tombs had been exploited by tomb robbers and treasure hunters over several millennia, much remained undiscovered in the area around Luxor, which proved a tempting target for archaeologists and thieves alike. Carter's duties as inspector therefore involved tracking down stolen items and apprehending thieves whenever possible. Many such artifacts would be brought to unscrupulous antique dealers, who would then sell them on to unsuspecting wealthy European visitors. Though Carter intercepted many suspected stolen objects in his investigations, he allowed their purchasers to keep them. Some stolen items would eventually make their way to the Cairo Museum after being purchased from dealers using Egyptian state funds. The Antiquities Service was responsible for building up the collection of the Cairo Museum and typically demanded a 50% share of the finds from each dig, with the other half going to the excavator and, eventually, into the collections of their private financial sponsors or those of public museums. Carter had a part to play in the division of these discoveries and used his influence to ensure that certain items from excavations led by Newbery would find their way to the Amhersts. In June 1903, Carter was also accused by a Dutch antiquities dealer of turning a blind eye to tomb robbers whose loot would eventually be purchased by the British Museum. But with over 500 miles under his jurisdiction, he could not be expected to be everywhere at once. During his 4 years in Luxor, Carter worked on the great temple of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel, shoring up one of the giant statues which tourists were accustomed to climbing on for photographs. At Abu Simbel, as at several tombs in the Valley of the Kings, Carter installed electric lighting, which not only improved the visitor experience but caused less damage to the paintings and reliefs compared to the candles and torches visitors were accustomed to using. As chief inspector, Carter was also responsible for supervising all the excavations taking place within Upper Egypt, and he took a particular interest in the excavation led by Lady Mary Cecil, the eldest daughter of William and Margaret Amherst, who would succeed to the title of Lady Amherst after her father's death in 1909. In 1901, Cecil had received permission from Carter to carry out excavations of important tombs near Aswan, and both Carter and Maspero were impressed at Lady Cecil's diligent documenting and reporting of her discoveries. In 1904, the Egyptians working for Lady Cecil uncovered several rare pieces of papyri in the Aramaic script dating from the Persian rule over Egypt in the 5th century BC. Carter took photographs of the papyri, which were intended for Didlington Hall, but went instead to the Cairo Museum. Despite his numerous duties as inspector, Carter also obtained permission from Maspero to carry out his own excavations. It was the dream of all archaeologists working in Egypt to discover a fully intact royal tomb that had been undisturbed for thousands of years. Back in late 1898, while he was working at Deir el-Bahari, Carter's horse stumbled and fell after coming across a hole, which Carter suspected was the entrance to a tomb. In January 1900, almost as soon as he had begun working for the Antiquities Service, Carter began excavating what turned out to be a sloping shaft, 150 metres in length, leading to a burial chamber. The work was not completed until the end of the year, and Carter was bitterly disappointed to find that the chamber was largely empty, though his team did find a large sandstone statue of a king seated on his throne. Carter established that the tomb had been built for King Mentuhotep II from the 21st century BC. The same king was responsible for a vast mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, directly beneath that of Hatshepsut's, and the structure that Carter discovered may have been a decoy or dummy tomb. Carter continued excavations in the Valley of the Kings, financed by the American businessman Theodore Davis, and in early 1903 he discovered his first royal tomb, that of Thutmose IV of the 18th dynasty, where they found an empty sarcophagus and part of a war chariot. In 1903 and 1904, Carter also worked on tomb number 20 in the Valley of the Kings, where he found the sarcophagi of Queen Hatshepsut and her father, Thutmose I. Egyptologists now believe that the tomb had initially been excavated for Thutmose, and Hatshepsut had enlarged it for her own burial, but Thutmose's body was later removed to a new tomb, while Hatshepsut's successors removed her mummy to a less prominent tomb. Indeed, Carter had also discovered a new tomb designated number 60, where 2 female mummies were found. Though Carter did not consider it worthwhile carrying out further work on this smaller tomb, one of the mummies has been identified as Hatshepsut's wet nurse, and the other, which was tested by the Egyptian Museum of Antiquities in 2007, is believed to be the Queen herself. After 5 years in Luxor, in September 1904, Carter became Chief Inspector of Lower Egypt, based in Cairo, in a job swap with James Quibell. Within a few months of starting his new position, Carter was involved in the so-called Saqqara affair on the 8th of January. A group of French tourists visiting the necropolis at Saqqara near Giza were involved in a dispute with Egyptian staff working for the Antiquities Service over the provision of candles for the tombs. The Egyptians refused to give a refund to the French party, who responded by beating some of the staff. By the time Carter arrived, the dispute was still underway, and he gathered a small group of men to reinforce his guards. A violent fight broke out between the two groups, and a number of men were injured from both parties. The French reported the incident to the police, blaming Carter for ordering the Egyptians to beat them up, while Carter complained about the destruction of Egyptian government property. A formal commission of inquiry at the end of January found in Carter's favour, but this would not be the end of the matter, as the affair heightened the tensions between the British and French communities in Egypt. The French resented the British for exercising de facto political control over the Egyptian government, while the British resented the French for their preferential position on cultural matters. Despite efforts by Maspero and the British Consul-General Lord Cromer to effect a compromise by asking Carter to express his regrets about the incident to the French Consul-General, Carter stubbornly defended his position and threatened to resign from the Antiquities Service if the Frenchmen were not punished. Both Theodore Davis and Edouard Naville begged Carter in vain to show some flexibility. But in mid-February, Carter received letters from Maspero informing him that his Inspectorate of Lower Egypt was to be reduced in size and renamed the Inspectorate of the North, and he was to move his base from Cairo to the town of Tanta, located around halfway between Cairo and Alexandria. Though Maspero was desperate to retain Carter's services, he approved his request for a 3-month leave beginning a week after his arrival at Tanta on the 13th of March. After a month and a half in England, Carter returned to Egypt in May to carry out his duties as Inspector of the North, choosing to base himself in Cairo while living quarters could be prepared for him in Tanta. He made the move in July, but his new surroundings were a far cry from what he had been used to during his 5 years at Luxor, where he was surrounded by grand monuments. By the end of October, he was unhappy with his living arrangements at Tanta and resigned his inspectorate, placing his future career in Egypt in serious doubt. After resigning from the Antiquities Service, Carter decided that he would return to painting. Throughout his work in Egypt and despite his onerous duties, Carter had earned some extra income on the side by carrying out commissions for foreign visitors. For the next 3 years, Carter returned to Luxor and his former collaborator Theodore Davis employed him to make drawings and paintings of the artifacts uncovered in his excavations while ensuring that he had a steady stream of commissions from tourists. Carter's career remained precarious and uncertain, and in the summer of 1907 he spent an extended period back in England. His patrons, the Amhersts, were experiencing financial difficulties and were forced to sell Didlington Hall. The death of Lord Amherst in 1909 created further distance with the family, though Carter was involved in deciding the fate of Amherst's Egyptian collection. Carter would soon gain a new patron in the form of the Earl of Carnarvon, whose country estate of Highclere Castle is best known as the filming location of Downton Abbey. Lord and Lady Carnarvon made their first visit to Egypt in 1905, and in 1907 the aristocrat obtained permission to excavate near Thebes with little success. The chief inspector for Upper Egypt, Arthur Weigel, was uncomfortable with the idea of aristocratic amateurs such as Carnarvon working with minimal supervision, and in 1908 wrote to Maspero requesting new supervisory arrangements. Maspero responded by recommending Carter's services to Carnarvon, resulting in the start of a fruitful partnership after Carter joined Carnarvon in 1909. The two men worked on an unpromising sector of the necropolis in front of Hatshepsut's temple, but Carter and Carnarvon established strict protocols over the excavations to protect any discoveries. Carter's arrival had a recognizable impact on the quality of the excavations and how they were documented and reported. For the next 3 years, Carter and Carnarvon continued their work in Thebes. Their discoveries included the remains of temples from the reigns of Hatshepsut and the king Ramesses IV from the 12th century BC. Though many sites in the area had already been destroyed by tomb robbers and white ants, their work on the tombs of royal officials uncovered plenty of painted coffins, small statues, furniture, jewellery, and cosmetic equipment. After the 1911 season, Carter helped Carnarvon prepare the report for his finds to date in the publication 5 Years' Explorations at Thebes, giving the impression that Carter had worked with Carnarvon since 1907. Though Carnarvon had not begun his excavations with the intention to build a collection for himself, he developed an interest over time, and Carter was more than happy to assist him by using his networks of antiques dealers in Luxor to supply Carnarvon with ancient artifacts for his own collection. Carter's practice of acting as an agent for private clients was not illegal at the time, and antiquities dealers were licensed and registered by the Antiquities Service, even if enforcement of regulations was limited, and the Cairo Museum rarely exercised its power to confiscate items suspected of being stolen from excavation sites. Carter applied to the museum for licenses to export the items intended for Carnarvon's collection, chiefly sculptures and jewellery made of gemstones and precious metals. Most of these items ended up at Highclere Castle, though others would go to the British Museum in London and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Maintaining his reputation for propriety and professionalism, Arthur Weigel disapproved of Carter's role in the antiquities trade, contributing to a strained relationship between Carter and the chief inspector. In 1912, Carnarvon and Carter obtained a second concession to dig at a site in the delta identified as the city of Zeus, an ancient provincial capital known as Sakha in Arabic, though the finds were poorly documented and considered unsuccessful. The following year, Carter carried out an exploratory dig at Tel el Balamun near the sea, where he managed to establish the ancient town's geography and found a large collection of silver jewellery. In the meantime, Carnarvon had relinquished the concession in Thebes, hoping to obtain the one for the Valley of the Kings. Theodore Davis held the permit since 1905, and after discovering 9 royal tombs in as many years, believed that no more discoveries of note were to be made. Carter and Carnarvon signalled to Maspero that they wished to obtain Davis's concession, and after the 77-year-old American gave it up in the spring of 1914, Carnarvon was granted the concession. At around this time, the 68-year-old Gaston Maspero resigned as Director General of the Antiquities Service due to ill health and was succeeded by Pierre Lecoux, the director of the French Institute in Cairo. In early 1911, Carter had moved into a new house next to the entrance of the Valley of the Kings, anticipating that he would be given the opportunity to carry out further excavations there. Carter's first task was to carry out further work at a tomb suspected to be that of King Amenhotep I, the 18th dynasty pharaoh from the early 16th century BC. A couple of years earlier, Carter had been led to the site by a local acquaintance who sold him some artifacts with the name of Amenhotep and his mother, Queen Amosa Nefertari, inscribed on them. Though he found very little in the tomb, in the spring of 1914 he cleared the debris, finding very little to definitely identify the tomb. This was the last piece of work Carter and Carnarvon carried out before the outbreak of the First World War in Europe in August 1914. With the war expected to be over by Christmas, Carter returned to Egypt that autumn for the new season, which started in February 1915, with the clearance of the tomb of King Amenhotep III, who ruled Egypt for most of the first half of the 14th century BC. By mid-1915, the war was taking longer than anticipated and was not set to end any time soon, and Carter became an intelligence officer in Cairo. While the precise nature of his work during the war is unclear, his Arabic skills would have been an asset. Carter's work seems to have been intermittent, since he frequently went down to Luxor to check on the sites and the activities of the antiques dealers, especially as security of the sites was diminished in wartime, while the absence of competition from European travellers enabled Carter to pick up bargains for Carnarvon's collection, as well as the Metropolitan Museum and the Cleveland Museum of Art. The German Egyptologist Ludwig Burchard claimed that Carter was responsible for destroying the German house at Kurna, home to the German Archaeological Institute in Luxor. Carter's wartime years were otherwise rather mundane, and he turned his mind to academic publication and proposed working with the classicist Hugh Evelyn White on an exhaustive record of the Royal Theban necropolis, though the project was never completed. From 1916 to 1918, Carter collaborated with Alan Gardiner, the editor of the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, published by the Egypt Exploration Fund, supplying articles on the artifacts he found while working with Carnarvon. In the summer of 1916, Gardiner asked Carter to draw a series of reliefs and inscriptions at the Temple of Luxor, completed during the reign of King Tutankhamun in the second half of the 14th century BC. Carter made 15 plates by the spring of 1917, but the project was never completed and remained unfinished. result of the Times deal and the visitors. The entrance to the burial chamber was guarded by 2 life-size statues, and its opening was scheduled for the 16th of February 1923. Luxor was full of tourists and journalists in keen anticipation of the great reveal. After 2 hours chiselling at the doorway, Carter entered the burial chamber, followed by Carnarvon and Lecaux, and a distinguished set of archaeologists and government officials. Over the following days, other dignitaries were invited to the chamber, including Queen Elizabeth of the Belgians and Viscount Allenby, the British High Commissioner to Egypt, who had previously served as Commanding General of the British Army in the Middle East during the First World War. While Lucas and Mace had been relatively undisturbed in their work in the tomb of Sethos II, both Carter and Carnarvon were the focus of attention for the press and influential visitors. Having worked on the site for 4 months, at the end of February, an exhausted Carter and the team took a short break from work, filling in the tomb and shutting the laboratory at Sethos's tomb. The pause in work may also have been prompted by the tensions between Carter and Carnarvon, which could have been exacerbated by rumours of an affair between Carter and Carnarvon's daughter, Lady Evelyn. By the end of February, the 2 men were reconciled, and the work on Tutankhamun's tomb could continue. The plan was to continue conservation work on the items taken from the antechamber before undertaking further work on the burial chamber. Carter had established a meticulous, albeit complicated, system of documenting all the finds, featuring record cards, photographs by Burton, and additional notes from Mace and Lucas, all of which were intended for publication in a scholarly report. As the work progressed, some items were ready to be sent to the museum in Cairo, though no decision had yet been made on how to divide the artifacts between Carnarvon and the Cairo Museum, and on the 14th of March, the Carnarvons left Luxor for Cairo to discuss the matter. Lord Carnarvon had been bitten by a mosquito in Luxor, a bite which became infected after a razor cut, with the illness progressing from blood poisoning to pneumonia, and on the 20th of March, Carter left for Cairo to accompany his bedridden patron. Carter remained in Cairo following the arrival of Lady Carnarvon on the 26th, and was present when Carnarvon died on the 5th of April 1923. Carter had not only lost a patron, but a friend, though Carnarvon's widow, Lady Almina, would retain her late husband's permit, allowing work on Tutankhamun's tomb to carry on. Carter returned to Thebes to supervise the necessary security arrangements to close the excavation season, leaving Luxor on the 19th of May. On his return to England on the 30th of May, he met Lady Carnarvon and her daughter and discussed with them the fate of Carnarvon's Egyptian collection, as well as general matters concerning the late lord's estate. Carter had become an international celebrity and was invited to deliver lectures about his discovery at academic and scientific institutions in Europe and the United States. His lack of experience initially prompted him to decline many such invitations, but he delivered his first lecture in September at the Royal Scottish Geographical Society in Edinburgh, while a series of 3 further lectures were given in London later that month. The lectures were generally well received, and Carter was encouraged to arrange a lecture tour in the United States for the following year. He also spent much of the summer working with Mace on the publication of the first volume of his account of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, intended for a popular audience. Carter returned to Egypt in October 1923, hoping to continue work on the tomb based on an agreement signed by Lady Carnarvon and the Antiquities Service, which restricted Carter's work to the tomb itself, with responsibility for the rest of the valley reverting back to the government. However, he would soon find his work for the season disrupted by a dispute with the Egyptian authorities. The difficulties had arisen after political developments in Egypt, where Sultan Ahmed Fuad had been proclaimed King Fuad I in March 1922, while a new constitution was adopted the following April with universal male suffrage. Though Lord Allenby retained considerable control over the country as British High Commissioner, it was widely expected that nationalist politicians would take charge in the 1924 elections. In late October, before getting the opportunity to reopen the tomb, Carter was already facing difficulties from the press. Earlier in October, he agreed with the Antiquities Service that Arthur Merton, formerly of the Times but now on Carter's staff, would give a daily press briefing in the evening to the Times and one to the Egyptian press the following morning, in order to ensure that news arrived in London and Cairo at the same time, an arrangement which was protested by the rest of the international press. A further dispute with the Antiquities Service over the extent of government supervision delayed the resumption of work until mid-November, but a disagreement about visitor numbers prompted Carter to threaten to withdraw his team from the tomb. Carter stubbornly resisted a demand from the Antiquities Service to provide a full list of staff working on the tomb, recognizing that Arthur Merton was the intended target. With much of his time taken up by such disputes, it was only on the 21st of December that Carter and his team started dismantling the shrines enclosing the sarcophagus in the burial chamber. On the 3rd of January, the quartzite sarcophagus was uncovered, but the Antiquities Service complained that a Times journalist had visited the tomb without permission, and no Egyptian inspector was present at the opening. These issues delayed the official opening of the sarcophagus to the 12th of February 1924, in the presence of Egyptian government ministers and other dignitaries. After removing the granite lid of the sarcophagus, Carter and Mace unravelled the linen shrouds covering the coffin until a full-length image of King Tutankhamun was revealed, to the delight and wonderment of those present. Within less than 24 hours of the opening of the sarcophagus, work ground to a halt after Carter was informed by Muhammad Pasha Zaghloul, the Under-Secretary of State in the Ministry of Public Works in charge of the Antiquities Service, that a planned viewing on the 13th of February for the wives of dignitaries was banned by the minister. At noon on the 13th, a furious Carter announced that the tomb was to be closed to visitors with no further work carried out. Though Lacau regretted the decision in private, he made no effort to persuade the ministry to change its mind and defended the Egyptian state. In a mirror image of the Saqqara affair, Carter was now defending the interests of foreign visitors against the Antiquities Service. Carter exhibited a similar level of stubbornness as he had 2 decades earlier by suing the service for his right to work on conditions granted by Lord Carnarvon's initial concession. He could count on the support of several prominent friends and collaborators in this endeavour, including Alan Gardiner and Percy Newbery. During this latest impasse, Arthur Callender and Arthur Mace would leave Carter's team, and on the 20th of February, the Ministry of Public Works cancelled Lady Carnarvon's permit and instructed Lacau to reopen the tomb. Carter responded by initiating a second lawsuit, and the matter remained unresolved when he left Egypt on the 21st of March in advance of his American lecture tour. On the 12th of April, Carter left Southampton for New York, where he received an enthusiastic public reception and remained the focus of considerable press attention throughout his time in North America. On the 23rd of April, he began his series of public lectures at Carnegie Hall, where he would speak about the discovery of the tomb as well as the finds uncovered during the recently curtailed season. After New York, he traveled to Philadelphia, New Haven, Washington, and Baltimore, and on the 8th of May, he was invited to the White House for a detailed discussion with President Calvin Coolidge. Carter was invited to give a private talk the following day to the president and a small number of guests, but a family bereavement prevented the Coolidges from attending. After brief stops in Boston and Hartford, Connecticut, Carter headed to the Midwest in mid-May, and by the 20th he was in Chicago. The American Egyptologist James Breasted and founder of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute had been working on the tomb with Carter and was the first person to encourage him to deliver lectures. Breasted was duly impressed with 2 public lectures and a private one for the University of Chicago delivered by Carter over the course of 4 days. After stops in Cincinnati, Detroit, and Cleveland, Carter went on to Canada on the 7th of June and spoke in front of audiences in Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. Carter's punishing lecture schedule was accompanied by news from his lawyer that his dispute with the Egyptian authorities had not yet been settled. His lecture tour ended on the 15th of June, and he returned to the United States, where he received an honorary doctorate from Yale University on the 17th. Carter ended his stay in North America with a 2-week rest in New York before returning to England for the summer. The lecture tour seems to have been a lucrative undertaking, and Carter may have used his fees to purchase an annuity of £1,000 a year. With some of the money, he hired a car and driver for an extended holiday in central England. In November, he met with Lady Carnarvon, who agreed to renounce her claims on the artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb and helped her arrange the transfer of her late husband's collection to the Bank of England for safekeeping in advance of a sale. After a brief lecture tour in Spain at the end of the month, Carter returned to England and left for Egypt on the 10th of December, arriving in Cairo on the 15th. By the time of his arrival, the nationalist Egyptian government had fallen, and the new administration, led by Ziaur Pasha, proved more accommodating to British interests. Carter met the new Prime Minister on the 28th of December, who agreed that work on the tomb should recommence as soon as possible, and on the 12th of January 1925, the terms of a new concession were agreed whereby the Carnarvon estate would renounce its share of the finds, but the Egyptian government would offer at its discretion Lady Carnarvon any duplicates from the tomb. Carter arrived in Luxor on the 19th of January, and on the 25th the tomb was officially handed back to Carter. His team for the season still included Callender, Lucas and Burton, though the former would soon quit for financial reasons. Carter additionally recruited Dr. Harold Nelson from the University of Chicago to work on studying the tomb's texts. Further work was carried out on the items taken out of the tomb during the previous season, including several trumpets which continued to sound loud and clear when blown. The curtailed season ended at the end of March after 2 months of work and 19 crates shipped to the Cairo Museum. After his return to England, he spent the summer of 1925 working on the second volume of his account of the discovery, dealing mainly with the burial chamber, which was not published until 1927. Carter returned to Egypt in October 1925, keen to get on with the work of opening the coffins and unwrapping the mummy of the boy king. The task was one of exceptional delicacy, and Carter was irritated that Lacau would not be in Luxor until the 10th of November to witness the reveal. The delay was fortuitous for Carter, as the process of removing 3 coffins and the removal of the amulets and jewelry found within them would take much longer than anticipated. The lid of the outer gilded coffin was removed on the 13th of October, revealing yet another gilded wooden coffin, which was opened on the 23rd and was found to contain a solid gold inner coffin and the famous golden mask, to the surprise of the excavators. The unwrapping of the mummy duly began on the 11th of November in the tomb of Setos II in the presence of Egyptian dignitaries, and the process took 4 days in total. After removing all the objects found on the body that was wrapped in linen bandages, the human remains of the king were removed piecemeal from the coffin. On the 31st of December, Carter and an armed guard accompanied the gold coffin and the mask as it was transported to the Cairo Museum by train. Working alongside Lucas, Carter spent the early months of 1926 restoring the jewellery found on the body. In the meantime, Dr. Douglas Derry and Dr. Saleh Bey Hamdi examined the king's remains, which were in poorer condition than hoped. Carter left Egypt and returned to England in May, where, in August, he helped to arrange the sale of the Carnarvon collection to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, whose team in Egypt had helped Carter considerably in the work on Tutankhamun's tomb. By September, he was back in Egypt, operating on the basis that he would have 3 months of uninterrupted work before the beginning of the tourist season in December. On the 23rd of October, Carter and Lucas placed the body of the king back into the gilded coffin and returned it to the burial chamber. The following day, Carter turned his attention to the small room next to the burial chamber, which he called the treasury. In addition to the large statue of the jackal god Anubis, the most important object in the room was a box, inside of which were the 4 canopic vessels containing the king's internal organs and decorated with the heads of 4 goddesses. The removal of objects from the treasury continued for the remainder of the season, a highlight of which was the visit of King Fuad on the 31st of December, who commended